Imposter syndrome is something that I've struggled with for a long time, coming from South Central Los Angeles, going to the different experiences that I've had, college, living in Europe, all of these things, getting this knowledge from very niche moments, the Syrian refugee crisis, experiencing that, the Paris boom booms, the shift of Europe much more to the right, Brexit, all of these things, the militarization of Europe against migrants and refugees, which you would think is really relevant to what's occurring today, which is extremely true. It feels like I have a bunch of the experiences and certain niches that would set me up to being very useful in this moment. And that's scary because in my postgrad, I did a thesis that went against the norms and when it comes to like the legal scholarship, right? I went towards a thesis that had barely any like legal rhetoric around it, which means that I had to really utilize a lot of my legal analysis and all of that, educational bullshit in order to push my thesis, which is basically criticizing traditional law for its shortcomings and actually addressing the psychosocial, so the intergenerational consequences of historical trauma. It's not sustainable to only promote a legal and criminal solution to mass scale violence because ultimately, in centering the healing of the collectives, you only try to fix the governance of it. So you give amnesty and all of these things without actually healing the people, right? I thought that was gonna be a bunk. I thought I was gonna fail. I got merit, so I got honors on my thesis. So ultimately, it provided something, right? Which is crazy because it has a lot to do with why MAGA happened, right? We didn't stop the Confederacy. We didn't stop the Yazis when it comes to the ideology, and now they're here. And now in the last couple of days, I've been promoting a solution, right? The solution will be in overwhelming their channels to force them to realign, right? How do we do that? I've been saying that we have to force our state governments as blue states to actually leverage that blue economy, particularly California, and that blue power in order to force judicial and legislative decision making. Because what we need to do in order to be capable of pushing our state governor to move much more outside of constitutional norms is to exhaust the reality that we've exhausted the Congress and we've exhausted the courts, because wherever law ends, tyranny begins, and therefore the state is capable of accelerating response in accordance to what the federal rogue government is doing. That is what American theory positions. And honestly, that in itself seemed really fucking crazy because I'm not really used to going beyond the sharing of knowledge and actually going to the solutions, because ultimately I hold myself back on the fact that these has consequences if they are aligned with, right? And ultimately what we see is that there is a difference within that theory and then actually producing those solutions that will most likely gain some consequences, right? So I'm always hesitant to promoting solutions because I know that they're capable of producing certain outcomes that will harm. But ultimately, we cannot get through this without that harm, without this discomfort, right? But just reading this email in my email from Indivisible, How We Fight Authoritarianism Through Non-Cooperation, it really affirmed what I've been pushing, right? They position, this is how we fight back against Trump's authoritarian takeover, by identifying our influence, what the pillars of support his regime depends upon, and convincing them to participate in strategic non-cooperation. Now, we're not going to do that with the federal GOP because for over a decade, they've been positioning they wanted exactly this. We cannot convince the Scottish majority because they already are secure in their, politicization. And then also, I believe Minnesota was an example to even Republicans and conservative officials that they can get got, right? Because who protects the judges? It is the U.S. Marshals that is under him. The public institutions, the private institutions, they will be depending on funding that he has control over. Colombia is giving him over $200 million in order to restore funding. Now, the states are restricting themselves, California, by promoting that, oh, I'm Gavin Newsom, but I can't do anything because the federal government is above the state. And ultimately, they sit on weaponized incompetence to not do anything because they don't want to actually jeopardize, funding. So in this reality, we have institutions and pillars who say, I have to follow orders, right? So in this reality, we have to think of who are the most powerful pillars that we are capable of actually impacting and driving, right? And that is the state governor, that is the state government, and not necessarily the state legislature, because by the time they actually resolve anything, it's going to take some time. We need emergency powers from the state governor. So the question becomes, how do we force a state governor to leverage on their emergency powers in order to force the Congress and the courts to accelerate the decision making so that we can have outcome in which we know whether or not the Congress and the courts are for or against the Constitution. I positioned in a last video that with Congress, that is impeachment. The purpose is not to impeach him, but to keep record of who voted how. And for the courts, that is forcing through a state's, expansion of power. So maybe ending federal taxation, right, to the federal government. Maybe declaring oneself as a free state away from ICE and actually making it illegal to participate in those campaigns, right? Obviously, that's going to lead to litigation, which is the purpose, because the purpose is for the courts to position, well, are you going to align with the Constitution, or are you going to justify that the constitutional collapse has happened? Now, reality, the state gets much more power outside of the constitutional norms, but ultimately, we need non-cooperation in order to trigger that advancement of political willingness that comes from the Congress, but also the judiciary, right? We have to force them. South Korea forced them through protests. How can we force not the federal, but the state to leverage against the federal? And that's our route, because we cannot make that difference directly to the federal. We have to utilize our state in order to leverage it.